American Box. Okay, so Steve, if you're ready then, if you'd like to share, you don't have to go share your screen and carry on. You're not on, oh, you're unmuted now, yes. So Steve's going to give us channel mail. So not tomorrow. Right, I'll leave you to it, Steve.
From the beginning.
That's it, you're there.
Just get rid of the little pictures.
Yes, the gallery gets in the way if you hide it.
Oh, I've got rid of you all except for Chris. Okay, how's that?
That's fine. That's fine. I think you're on page 2 now, Effect of the 7 Years' War. That's Dover Calais.
Okay, good, thank you.
That's it, I think that's the first page.
Sounds a bit, does the sound okay?
Sounds fine.
Good.
Sounds okay.
Right, so here we go then. Now, this is not a normal sort of display that I would give. It's not a complete display. It doesn't have an introductory page because it's a work in progress. What I've done is within the number of sheets that I've been asked to give, I'm going to take some aspects of cross-channel mail. So it would be too big a subject to tackle with just one small display. That's why I call it aspects. What I've chosen to do is just to select some items, and there's 40. You're going to have 44 sheets. I've selected some items that have been of interest to me over the last few years as I've been starting to look at cross-channel mail. I did that when I am fully exhausted, but the Mediterranean mail and the transatlantic mail are fairly complete now, though they'll never be complete. And I've looked at West Africa, so I thought, well, let's have a go at cross-channel mail, which is a bit of a challenge for me because I know absolutely nothing about British postal history. So I'm learning on the job. So of the material that I'm going to show you, though, there are several themes that you will see quite a bit of. I'm particularly interested in the effect of conflict and wars on the routing of mail across the channel, and how conflict results in changes to the way in which the mail was carried. I'm also interested, and have been for several years now, in the role that the railway companies played in relation to cross-channel mail. Now, this isn't a display which looks at the railway companies, because that would be 80 sheets long. But I've picked out, of the 44 I'm going to show you today, there are about half a dozen, I think, which are some of the nicer items which relate to this story of how mail ended up going across the channel. So we'll start off with going back to 1699 and 1701. And as we know, originally letters were marked to indicate the origin, rather than, as it became later, the entry mark, where the point at which the mail entered the country. So here we've got two early examples. I've chosen one which is a cachet and one which is a manuscript. So you've got from San Malo on the left, and you've got Marseille on the right. If you could see the rear, you'd be able to see London foreign bishop marks, but you'll see one of those in a few minutes. So that's, if you like, the starting point, whereby we're having departure marks. Now, the first conflict is that I've chosen is the War of the Spanish Succession. As you can see, it's 1701 to 1714, and mails from Italy and Spain to England had to be redirected and use the turn and taxis post going via Netherlands. And instead of that, that was how it was. Instead, they were carried through France. Now, how do we know that? Well, looking at this cover, you can see two things. On the bottom left, you'll see the manuscript mark showing the route that it was to be taken. It says via Lyon, which is Lyon. And at the top left, you can see a slightly unusual cachet, which is a P within a circle. And this indicates that the mail was carried through Paris and then Calais and Dover. The bishop mark you can see on the right-hand side, and the charge is 2 and 6, which is the amount for a double rate letter. We then got to the 7 Years' War. Instead of the usual route via Dover and Calais, from 1758, mail was sent via Flushing and Ghent and Lyon. You can see that on the letter on the left, which has come from London to Bordeaux and has gone via Flushing. There's a notation on the rear of the letter, which is obviously the top as you're looking at it, which shows the Hollande French entry mark. The letter on the right, though, has an extra interest, if you like. That was sent in after the reopening, yes, of the mail in 1763. So we're going back to Calais again at the end of the war. And here's a letter, 1764. And if you look kind of in the middle right-hand side, you can see 2, 2, N, and 8, which puzzled me for some time. But that is an indication. The first 2 is that it's a double rate letter. And then the 2 and 8, if you think about it, was the phonetical way of writing 2 shillings and 8pence, 2 and 8. So there we have it, and I've shown how the 2 and 8 is broken down. On the right-hand side, you can see the Paris to London, which was 6pence, but times 2 for a double rate letter, and London to Edinburgh, which 10pence times 2, which gives you 2 shillings and 8, the amount to be paid. Maybe it's common to you, but as I say, I don't know much about British postal history, but I hadn't come across a phonetical writing of the charge before. I just thought I would show you this one as being really one example of what are fairly ubiquitous entry marks. From the carriage by the Dover to Calais, Paris. You've got Angleterre and you've got d'Angleterre. And there are lots of various sizes and typefaces for them. I've just selected these 2. Otherwise, you could have pages and pages of them and we'd all fall asleep. They were applied at Calais from 1739 onwards. Now we've got more problems again, problems between England and France, in part linked to the American War of Independence this time. And it caused cross-channel mail from 1779 to be routed via Newport in summer or Ostend in winter, and Brussels and Valenciennes. So here the Turntaxis post was used for the transit of British mail going into France. And the evidence of that, you can see on both of those covers, is the circular cachet, DAB, which was applied at Brussels. So here we've got two letters from London, both to Dunkirk and Calais, with that cachet that I've just mentioned. Now you can see that despite the Dover-Calais packet having resumed in 1783 after the Articles of Peace had been signed, the example of the right-hand letter shows that mail was still in 1783, September, being carried via Ostend. Again, that's because of the DAB marking. So, you know, dates that were given for when services ceased and when services resumed aren't always the be-all and end-all of determining the method or the routing by which the mail was actually carried. (1793), a bit of trouble again between the French and the Dutch Republic and England. And there was an invasion of Austrian Netherlands and a siege at Maastricht. So mail was being sent this time via Flushing and Middelburg and Ghent. So it was carried first by the Zealand post and then again exchanged with the Turntaxis at Ghent. On the right-hand letter, you can see the cachet Ostend, which was a cachet that the Turntaxis post used at their temporary frontier office in Ghent at this time. And both letters, left and right, have got the d'Angleterre, which was applied at Paris, as I understand it, to bundled British mail. Now let's move on to the Continental Blockade. The service was suspended in 1803, and Napoleon was starting to get stroppy by 1806, and he actually passed a decree declaring a blockade of all British ports. I suppose that was something to do with the fact that Britain had been blockading their ports for some time before that. And there was a decree that all mail to or from Great Britain or in the English language was to be confiscated. So as a consequence, people had to find alternative ways of moving the mail between our two countries. So the example on the left was sent via Hamburg, and you've got the rayon marking RN4, which was applied on that particular routing. And on the right-hand side, it was sent via Antwerp, more the south coast of Holland. Of course, another way of getting the mail across was for it to be how we describe it as being smuggled across the channel, carried in a private ship out of the mails. And here's one which was sent to Rouen, sent via Rouen to Cognac. It's a commercial letter from London. Interesting, because he discusses the possibility of sending coal to Charonne or Rochefort and receiving fruits from Bordeaux. He also mentions that he'd sent a previous letter to the same person via Holland. But in this case, he'd entrusted it to someone to take it across the channel. And there it had been handled by a forwarding agent. You see that on the rear, which is the right-hand side of how it's displayed here. And there's a faint cancellation of 74 Rouen. So that's where it was put into the post for the first time, and hence the charge of 7 decimes for the 500 to 600 kilometre distance. Things calmed down a bit. Napoleon didn't do so well, and so the services, the cross-channel service, was restored. Here's an example of a letter being sent from London to Bordeaux, and was actually held knowing that or awaiting the restoration of the services. You can see from the dates that the service was reopened on the 19th of April, but this letter was dated 22nd of March. So it was held until the packet resumed, and actually got to Bordeaux on the 27th of April. Here's an example of a letter which was delayed for even longer. It was actually written in 1811 and wasn't carried until the service was resumed in 1814, received in London on the 15th of May, 1814. It was carried privately to Calais. There were no French postal markings. And there it was handed to the forwarding agent, who again, on the rear, that's the top, as it's displayed here, who endorsed it from Cooley of Calais. Carry it. And then he took it across, and it was then posted from Dover with a Dover 74 mark. Well, peace came along, but it didn't last long, as we know. It lasted from April 1814 until Napoleon decided to have another crack at things. From March 1815. But I've chosen this one to show that during the period of the restoration of mail, it wasn't just Dover to Calais that was used, but mail was also sent from Southampton to Havre. You can see here that there's a manuscript inscription at the bottom for it to be carried from Southampton. And there is a paid ship letter London Crown marking, unusually with a reversed date, 5181 instead of 1815, which has been crossed out and corrected. I hope you can see that. And then we've got the Le Havre arrival cachet. So Napoleon having another go, as I mentioned, what we call the 100 Days War, which lasted from March into July. But during this time, cross-channel mails could still be sent. And here's a nice example of a letter which has come from Le Havre to London via Portsmouth. And there is, you can see in the centre, a ship letter Portsmouth Crown hand stamp, which was actually only in use during 1815. That's the only time it was used. Now I've come up with another unusual example of mail being carried at this period. Here's one sent from Rome. from the, well, it's sent as a diplomatic letter. It's sent in the diplomatic bag from the French embassy in Rome. And you can see that from the cachet at the top, which is P, Rome, P, jusqu'à Douvres, which indicates that it was paid up to Dover. But that's the mark that was used for carriage of mail in the diplomatic bag. Thought I'd better keep Chris happy with an example of mail going through Paris. So the 4 P's, PPPP, signify the postage paid on letters to Paris or transiting Paris. Obviously, these 2 examples are mail going to London. That's why they're here. That marking was applied from 1760, and there are lots of different types and sizes, and boxed and unboxed. And I've just chosen these 2 from 1816 and 1819 because it falls into this period that we're talking about now. So cross-channel mail, which is paid through Paris. I've chosen several examples now, three examples of forwarded mail that was used fairly extensively in this period in the first parts of the 19th century. Forwarding agents were used regularly for this. Here's Jacques Leveur at Calais, and he wrote on the left-hand side, which is the rear, an manuscript inscription on this letter sent from Rouen to London. And you can see on this slide, by this time, Monsieur Leveur had acquired and obtained a cachet, special forwarding agent cachet for the mail which he handled. And here's 2 examples of that, again, which you can see on the rear or the top as it's displayed here. I've chosen these 2 examples simply because well, you get 2 for the price of 1, but also one is a paid letter and one is an unpaid letter. You can see that from the Calais cachet. So here's mail that was carried via the forwarding agent system and then put into the postal service at Calais for onward carriage in France. You can see on this sheet a couple of different cachets from quite a significant forwarding agent, Maury. They were based in Calais and Boulogne, and the firm had several different sets of owners, if you like, and you can see that from the cachets as the number of names in the firm increased over the years. And the 2 examples I've chosen are from Liverpool to Lausanne and from Liverpool to Bordeaux. And they're the 2 cachets which were shown on the rear. We need an example or 2 of disinfected mail because that was significant in this period, particularly the 1830s. I've chosen one which results from an outbreak of cholera in East London, 1832, which started in Soho, and Arid claimed 6,536 lives. And perhaps we know more, being French specialists, about the outbreak which reached Marseille in 1834. And as we know, the mail often contains slits, disinfectant slits, with the aims of protecting it from cholera. Often you get a staining as well on the mail. The example on the right has a slight further interest in that's a free front. You can see the Earl of Waterford's signature on the bottom left on this disinfected item. But it wasn't sent free because that wasn't permitted from abroad. So the post office correctly charged the amount. I've put 12 decimes, but no, I'm not sure about that. Well, perhaps someone tell me, is that 12 decimes charged in France or 1 and 2 charged in England? Back to the standard entry marks. Again, you can see lots and lots of these. I've got dozens of them, but I've just shown these two to indicate the new type of markings which were introduced, showing where the mail had come from, in this case Angleterre, and the route that it took, i.e. the entry point into France. So you've got Calais at the top, and you've got Boulogne below. Angleterre Power. And finally, in this little bit here, change to a circular cachet. This case, I've got Angleterre Power Calais, but I've chosen 3 slightly different ones. One is a dated circle, one on the right is an undated circle, and the one down below is a smaller circle. So 3 examples of a fairly common entry mark which you see on cross-channel mail. Well, we're talking about a payment. Here is an example or 2 examples of the AEJF. The one on the left, which is unboxed with the dots. The one on the right, which is in a kind of diamond shape, I suppose, and shows the point of bureau exchange. The one on the right, therefore, has a number 1, which relates to Antibes. Now, this marking was used, AEJF, for mail which was sent from a foreign country and transited France and then went on to another country. So you can see the AEJF as opposed to AED, which was the one where it's paid to the destination. But we're looking at cross-channel mail, so we want the one which indicates payment jusqu'au frontière, JF. And there's 2 examples. I want to show you 3 examples here of the movable box, because that was quite a significant part of the story for cross-channel mail. I've got 24 sheets of this, but I've selected 3 quite nice ones. We know about the movable box system, don't we? Some people call it a mobile box, but the importance is that it was able to be moved from its starting point to its end. In other words, it was used for mail which was handed in late, if you like. So it was carried down to the dockside, and the movable box was either at the gangplank or in some cases on the vessel itself. Certainly as the ship departed, the box was taken into the ship, and then when it arrived at the port, the box and its contents were taken off to the post office. The French call it the boîte mobile, And this example here that I've chosen is the first example of the French marking. The British had been having their MB marks from 1843, as we'll see on the next slide, but the French didn't get around to their own markings until 1857. And this one reads Angle, ANGL from Angleterre, BM, automobile, and then Le Havre. That's the point at which it ended, because this letter because this letter carried from London to Le Havre. It was actually, interestingly, carried on the General Steam Navigation Company. We know that because of the Denmark notation on the top left, which was one of their vessels. I'll come back to GSNC in a short time. Now, here's a really early example from November 1843. And you say, well, hang on a minute, there is no MB marking on it. No, that's because there was a delay. The Postal Convention was effective from 1st of June 1843, but Britain's MB hand stamps weren't introduced actually until December. What a number of people did in the meantime was to write par paquebot particulier. You can see that on the left-hand side of the front of the cover. We know that this particular one was actually applied by the firm Adams. You can see their cachet at the bottom left, Adams from Boulogne. These were private cachets in order to indicate that it was being carried under the convention of the movable box, because there was no additional charge from that. And you can see on the right-hand side the ship letter, London, Crown, Constellation, before it was carried on to Edinburgh. Started its life in Boulogne. So that's the cachet which was used for those early months, and some of them continued to use it subsequently, but it was originally intended to kind of indicate the service before the MB cachets were actually available. Hope that makes sense. Now, here is a nice example of a letter from Calais to London, sent as a consignee letter and exempt from postal charges, hence the Crown exempt ship letter, LR marking. It was carried between Calais and London. It was obviously taken as a late letter down to the docks, because you've got the MB, the movable box cachet. And we know again that this one was carried too on the General Steam Navigation Company because of the notation for the Belfast vessel. Unusual to find the combination of the two marks together. I just want to stay with General Steam Navigation Company, because if you like, a byproduct of looking at cross-channel mail, as I have been doing these last few years, and hence kind of another work in progress, is looking at the role that the General Steam Navigation Company played in the movement of mail across the Channel. They were a significant operator of services from as early as 1824, when their services were first started operating. They were operating initially to Leith, Scotland, but then to Ostend and Calais and Rotterdam and Margate and Ramsgate. And by 1826, they actually got 28 steamships, a significant operator. Now they continue to expand, and from our point of interest here, the GSNC were operating services from Brighton to Dieppe early, and then London to Boulogne, Dunkirk and Le Havre, and as well as Southampton to Lavra, Andover to Calais, and Newhaven to Dieppe. That's quite a significant number of routes. They actually won post office tenders for the carriage of mail between London and Boulogne from 1834, and then subsequently from London to Calais and Brighton to Dieppe. I'm going to talk about the railway companies in a second, and competition between General Steam and the railway companies was fierce. And as I'll explain in a second, there was an uneasy relationship between them. And we know that General Steam was granted authorization right from the beginning in 1843 to introduce movable boxes on most of their routes between England and France. So important. And I've chosen, because we've already seen some letters carried on General Steam's vessels, I've chosen to show that even by 1857, here's an original handbill which shows the daily London to Boulogne service operating each day. Mail entering at Brighton is particularly interesting. That's the General Steam Navigation Company's service. You can tell that in both these cases on the rear, hence at the top of the letter as displayed, with the Brighton cancellation, transit cancellation. So we know the route that it's taken. And here's two items going into London, yes, both to London, but having been carried over to Brighton. Most mail going cross-channel at this time was actually taken all the way into London, even if it was coming south again. It would do that. We know a similar situation occurred in France, don't we, where most mail was taken into Paris. Some was let off at Lille, but most mail was taken into Paris and then distributed from there. So it was too in London. But here's a nice example of a letter which obviously wasn't put in the London bag. It was carried separately because it was put off at Dover. You can see the cancellation on the right-hand side. En route along the south coast to Rye, cancellation on the left-hand side. We could have a look at a lot of aspects of the various Anglo-French postal conventions, and I could do lots of sheets on that, but we're just looking at different aspects. Here's a look at the 1836 convention, which allowed mail to be sent between France and Britain for the first time, either totally unpaid, paid to the frontier, or fully paid to the destination. The French element of the charge was calculated by use of a new rate based on distances measured to the border point. These rates and distances were different from those measured wholly within France. And then the British element was a bit more complicated. There was a fixed rate to London. That was 4p for the sea element and 6p for the inland. And then you've got the extra charge going beyond London. I've picked a particularly complicated example here, which is an example of a fully paid to destination letter, which was the least common of the three options that you had from 1836. And this was actually sent on the first day of the new convention, which is an attraction in itself. But you can see the total charge of 23 decimes, which is 1 and 3 plus the French 10 decimes. And the British element was made up for Calais to Dover 4p, Dover to London 6p, as I've just said, hitching was actually 7p, but there was a 2p rebate at this time for mail going beyond London for a single weight multiple letter of up to 1/4 ounce, and that's how you get to the total charge which is equivalent to 25 decimes. Again, with the 1836 convention, I've given you 2 examples of mail which was paid to the frontier. In both directions, Manchester to Amiens and Bayonne to London. So you've got one going each way across the channel. And you'll see the PF cachets to indicate the mail was paid to the frontier. The 1843 convention introduced the colonies, box colonies markings, which are commonplace. So I've chosen not to select one of those. There was a slight modification in 1856, which affects this example of cross-channel mail, which started in Lagos, in Nigeria, was carried by the African Steamship Company. But the interest here is the Colonies Art AT mark, excuse me, which was applied primarily to mail from the Americas, and unusually in this case from Africa. The art, of course, refers to the article under the convention and its modification. The 56 convention made further changes, and I've just shown you one sheet to look at the FR, accountancy markings applied at the Bureau d'Echange, which indicate the amount of reimbursement to France on the carriage of unpaid mail going across the channel at the rate of 2 francs, the bulk rate of 2 francs. And you can see the charges, the British charges. The one on the right has also got an OR, a rural cachet as well. Okay, let's look at something different now. So I've got 3 sheets. We're back to wars, Franco-Prussian War, and the effect it had on the mail. This one shows mail during the siege. Once the siege started in Paris, and the last mails being carried on the 18th of September. If you were sending a letter, you would want it to avoid Paris so they wouldn't get caught up in that. So here is a letter from Mexico to France via Britain. And it was sent via Amiens and Tours and then Bordeaux before going down to the Pyrenees, but carried via Paris, and obviously taking longer as a consequence of that. So it didn't actually arrive until the 4th of October, whereas it had entered France on the 26th of September. We know that from the entry mark at Calais. So, yes, slightly surprising, I suppose, that it has the ambulant cancellation from Calais to Paris, but it must have been being used on the diverted route in order to avoid Paris. Second example I've chosen is mail coming in from Switzerland, which would have been carried via Belgium normally, but with the advance of the Prussian troops, the mail was instead routed via France. Now we know this because the rate changed from 3d travelling via Belgium to 5d when sent via France. This rate only lasted a few weeks, so examples are quite uncommon. And the third example I've used is that mail which was being sent from France to London was similarly having specific notation put on it to use the Southampton crossing in order to avoid the mail going through Paris and onwards to Calais. And that was applied even in this case where the letter actually originated at Le Havre, but was shown to go via Southampton. It was actually carried on the General Steam Navigation Company because it was carried on their service directly, not to Southampton in the end, but from Le Havre to London, where it received the paid London ship letter cancellation. Right, we'll just finish now with a section on the railway company's involvement, which, as I say, is a particularly interesting. I've got 80 odd sheets on that, which includes ephemera and all sorts of other interesting items. But during the 1840s, the rapidly expanding railway companies in Britain were keen to offer extensions to the routes across to the continent. The first one was the London, Brighton, South Coast Railway, which was initially transferring its passengers at Brighton to a General Steam Navigation Company vessel to Dieppe, then a coach to Rouen, and then a train to Paris. But in 1847, they thought they would have a go at operating their own company. But that wasn't approved. They weren't allowed to do that. They couldn't. There was the British law on railway companies prohibited them from owning shipping companies, and so they had to stick with General Steam Navigation Company. That continued until 1863, when they finally did get approval, and they joined together with the French railway operator L'Ouest in order to operate the cross-channel complete service, capitalised 1 and 2/3 respectively. Interesting that this map, which is an original map from an 1880 railway guide, also shows their service from Littlehampton to Honfleur, which is not one which is widely known, but certainly features in my bigger display. The second company to get into the act of going across the channel was the Southeastern Railway, which ran from Folkestone to Boulogne at this time. Now, oddly, they were successful in setting up their own shipping company, the Southeastern and Continental Steam Packet Company. But they managed to do that because they established a joint venture with a private company, and that enabled them to operate their own vessels. And here's an example of a consignment note of Southeastern Railway and the Chemin de Fer du Nord with French fiscal stamps on it. The third company was the London and Southwestern Railway Company, which was operating down to Southampton from 1846. And they had an involvement in shipping company, Southwestern Steam Navigation, which they eventually took full control of in 1863. And the example I've chosen to show is a rather nice illustrated card of London Southwestern Railway Company, showing their services to the continent, with on the rear explaining how you could get holiday tours in Normandy and Brittany if you used their service via Southampton. Quite a nice card. Here's another interesting example, of London and Southwestern Railway. They actually produced this envelope, advertising envelope. You can see on the top that it's advertising services to Paris. And there's a gentle dig at the bottom, which says that using crossing via Southampton. Southampton is a safe harbour and always accessible, which was a gentle dig at the other Channel ports. So by this time, even of 1844, the railway companies were beginning to market the services quite heavily. And as I say, with this example of pre-printed advertising envelope encouraging people to travel via Southampton and Le Havre. So here we've got an early French ambulant Constellation. The French railway companies were a bit later to get into the act of opening railway routes, and in fact, research has shown me that a lot of those French companies were reliant on either British capital or British engineers or British and Irish navvies to actually build the railways. The first ambulant cancellations were Ligne. Ligne du, in this case, Havre, but it could be Ligne du Calais or Ligne du Boulogne. Some people refer to them as being maritime marks, but they aren't. They are ambulant cancellations. So I've just chosen the one from Le Havre to show here. Though, as I say, you could see others as well. One quite unusual cancellation, though, is this one, Courier, SP L Ligne du Havre, which was used on mail carried out of Paris on the night service to Le Havre. As we've already said, most mail was actually carried up to Dover or Folkestone, Calais, Boulogne, but still some mail was being sent by Le Havre, and this is a nice example which was only in use from the 4th of August to the 20th of December in 1848, and it was believed only applied to the top letter in each bundle. You can see that on the blue, rather faint cachet on the top left, which is why I've shown a full copy of it. The British TPOs, they had their own cancellations. There was a day mail sorting carriage which left at London Bridge to go down to Dover, and you can see here two cachets, a small rectangular boxed one on the left, used on mail arriving from abroad and going into England, and on the right the circular one, which denotes the day mail. That's used on unpaid mail going to Paris, which is therefore taxed, and on arrival receives French postage due cancellation. I've read that the sorters on the British TPOs were quite sharp when they were cancelling the mail on board train, and even on incoming mail, which is unusual. Normally, they looked at outgoing mail, but as the example on the left shows, they obviously looked at this one coming in and applied their little small rectangular boxed cachet. We know about the Continental Nightmail. I've chosen just these two examples to show you the one on the left is perhaps slightly less commonly seen. And this was applied by the British on a mail going south towards France. And you've got the London and Dover TPO/night mail cancellation. That was used on ordinary mail. You do see it more commonly, though, on the cancellation on registered mail. And the marking you will see then is registered FNM, French night mail /London. So there's an example of ordinary mail and registered mail there. So two final examples to show you. We know about late female. There's plenty of late female between England and France and England, particularly between England and France, with various cancellations in use. But I've chosen to show a slightly unusual one. And this was a special train which left Liverpool at noon, 12 o'clock, and arrived at London at 5 o'clock in order to connect with the Continental Nightmail going to Dover. The late fee charge for this specific service was threepence, in addition to the normal postage, and also a special cancellation, which is NWRP office /Liverpool plus the 466 duplex of Liverpool. That mail is more scarce, and this example is actually in 1870. And so it is marked in manuscript to go via Southampton, presumably, again, as we've seen earlier, having concern about the routing of mail. So they're clearly marking it for it to go down to Southampton rather than London in order to catch the boat across to Havre so that it doesn't get delayed. And finally, we need to look at a French late mail used across the channel. So the French is the levée exceptionnelle, and the charge was 20 cents for the first quarter of an hour after the time of the last connection, 40 cents for half an hour, or 60 cents for 3/4 of an hour. This was then reduced as time went on. The example I've chosen to display is the second period, if you like. So it's lateness of up to half an hour with an extra charge of 40 centimes. So there we go. That's a kind of a quick snapshot look at aspects of cross-channel mail from various different little topicettes, if you like. I'm sure there will be errors in that, particularly in my understanding of some of the British postal history. But hey, if you don't, you've got to start somewhere. And you know, I've done a fair amount of research, but it's not necessarily complete. And as I have always said, one of the benefits of joining specialist societies is that you learn new things all the time. So I hope you've enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yes, that is a very, very comprehensive coverage of a very long and very complicated subject. Lots of wars involved, I think we're going back to another war at the moment, actually. I'm not quite sure. Another Anglo-French fish war this time, I think. We shall see. If anybody's got any questions, unmute yourselves and pose them now, please. No, everybody's totally baffled.
I've probably got a great deal of many questions, but I would like to see it and own some of them myself, I think.
Yes, there's an awful lot of things there, actually. I mean, it is
Yeah.
quite complex. Right.
Steve, can I ask you a question, Steve?
Yeah.
We know about the Navy prize letters at Kew, and you talked about Napoleon confiscating British mail. Has any of that mail survived from the French archives?
I don't know. Could be interesting, wouldn't it?
You never know. I shall stop recording now.